The steel boning of the corset bruised her ribs. Tessa stood in the suffocating heat of the kitchen, struggling to draw a full breath. The air was thick with the smell of seared Wagyu beef, white truffles, and raw, unfiltered panic. This was Aura. It was a velvet and gold fortress in the heart of Manhattan, a Michelin-starred sanctuary where Wall Street billionaires came to devour their wealth. But behind the swinging kitchen doors, it was a slaughterhouse for self-esteem. Tessa pulled at the stiff black fabric of her uniform. It was a size 14. She was a size 20. The general manager, Gideon, had ordered the uniform specifically to humiliate her. He was a man who worshipped at the altar of Manhattan vanity. He was a creature of spray tans, tailored suits, and venomous elitism. He believed his restaurant was a temple of aesthetic perfection, and he viewed Tessa as a grotesque crack in his pristine marble floor. He walked past her station, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the grease-stained tiles. He paused, his eyes raking over her tightly bound frame with undisguised disgust. He leaned in close, his voice a mocking whisper. He told her she looked like a stuffed sausage, a pathetic mistake in his beautiful restaurant. He said if she popped a single seam, he would make sure she never worked in this city again. Tessa did not cry. She did not flinch. She simply stared at the stainless steel counter, letting his cruel words wash over her like dirty water. She had learned long ago that invisibility was the only armor that worked in a place like this. She was not here for the glamour. She was not here to be a runway model serving caviar to hedge fund managers. She was here for the money. Every agonizing hour in this corset, every insult swallowed, every drop of sweat, translated into dollars. And those dollars went directly to a sterile, underfunded nursing home in Queens. They went to Rosa. Rosa was her grandmother. She was the only family Tessa had ever known. Rosa was not a soft, cookie-baking grandmother who knitted sweaters. She was a woman forged in the brutal, sun-baked mountains of Sicily. Tessa closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the memory of Rosa anchor her in the chaos of the kitchen. She remembered the smell of flour, old leather, and strong black coffee. She remembered the harsh, guttural sounds of the dialect Rosa had drilled into her head since childhood. It was the mountain dialect of Petralia Soprana. It was an ancient, grinding language that sounded like stones crushing bone. It was not the musical, romantic Italian of the movies. It was a language of survival, of blood, of secrets kept in the dark. Rosa had been a baker's daughter, but she had also smuggled weapons for partisans in the old country back in 1958. She had taught Tessa that a woman's strength was not in her waistline, but in her spine. Tessa took a shallow breath, the only kind the uniform allowed. She imagined her spine turning to solid iron. She would endure Gideon. She would endure the corset. She would endure the suffocating heat. She would endure it all to keep Rosa safe. Suddenly, the chaotic noise of the kitchen died. It was not a gradual quiet. It was an instant, terrifying silence, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The head chef stopped yelling. The sous chefs froze with their knives suspended in the air. The clinking of copper pans ceased entirely. The heavy double doors leading to the dining room swung open. Gideon burst through, his face the color of wet ash. He was sweating profusely, his usual arrogant swagger completely gone. He looked like a man who had just seen the devil waiting at his table. He clapped his hands, his voice trembling uncontrollably. He announced that Dante Vella had just walked into the restaurant. The name hit the kitchen like a physical blow. Even Tessa felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce her chest. The Vela Syndicate. They were a ghost story whispered in the darkest corners of New York. They were a global empire transitioning from old-world Sicilian brutality to modern corporate crime, and Dante Vella was the newly crowned king. Gideon grabbed a bottle of wine from the reserve cellar with shaking hands. It was a $5,000 vintage, covered in decades of dust. He shoved it into the hands of Bianca. Bianca was Gideon's favorite waitress. She was tall, impossibly thin, and possessed the kind of fragile, hollow beauty that Manhattan elites adored. But right now, Bianca was trembling so violently she could barely hold the heavy glass bottle. Gideon hissed at her, ordering her to serve the table. He told her to smile, to be perfect, to not make a single mistake. He warned her that these men did not forgive mistakes. Bianca walked through the swinging doors like a lamb walking to the slaughter. Tessa watched through the small circular window of the kitchen door. The dining room of Aura was usually a loud, vibrant theater of wealth. Tonight, it was a graveyard. The regular patrons were staring at their plates, terrified to make a sound. The clatter of silverware had vanished. In the center of the room, surrounded by heavily armed men in tailored suits, sat Dante Vella. He was 32 years old, lethally calm, and dangerously handsome. He did not look like a street thug. He looked like a dark prince holding court in a conquered city. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly bored by the opulent surroundings. He radiated an oppressive, suffocating darkness that made the air heavy and hard to breathe. Bianca approached the table. Her hands were shaking so badly the silver wine key rattled against the glass. She managed to uncork the bottle, but her breathing was erratic, bordering on hyperventilation. As she poured the dark red liquid into Dante's crystal glass, her wrist gave out. A single drop of wine fell. It landed on the pristine white tablecloth, spreading slowly like a drop of fresh blood. The entire restaurant stopped breathing. The armed men standing behind Dante shifted, their hands moving subtly toward the inside of their jackets. The silence in the room became absolute, ringing in the ears of everyone watching. Dante did not yell. He did not raise his hand. He simply looked at the red stain, and then he looked up at Bianca. His voice was smooth, quiet, and absolutely terrifying. He told her to leave. He did not raise his voice above a whisper, but the command echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. It was a dismissal that carried the weight of an execution. Bianca burst into tears, dropped the white linen napkin, and fled toward the kitchen. She pushed through the heavy doors, collapsing into a sobbing, trembling heap on the floor. Gideon was hyperventilating. His perfect night, his perfect restaurant, was crumbling before his eyes. He looked around the kitchen wildly, his eyes darting from one terrified server to another. No one moved. No one wanted to go out there. The chef stared at the floor. The busboys backed away into the shadows. Gideon's panicked gaze landed on Tessa. He lunged across the kitchen, grabbing her roughly by the arm. His manicured fingers dug into her flesh, leaving crescent moon bruises. He shoved the $5,000 bottle of wine into her chest. He told her to get out there. He told her to fix this immediately. He leaned into her ear, his breath hot and sour with fear. He swore that if she embarrassed him, if she spilled a single drop, he would blacklist her from every restaurant in New York City. He would make sure she starved in the streets. Tessa looked at the bottle in her hands. She looked at Gideon's sweating, pathetic face. She did not feel fear. A strange, heavy calm settled over her. The frantic panic of the kitchen faded away. The suffocating grip of the corset seemed to loosen just enough for her to take a real breath. She turned and pushed through the heavy double doors. The dining room was freezing. The air conditioning had been turned up, but the real chill came from the center table. Tessa walked across the thick velvet carpet. She did not rush. She did not tremble. She approached the table of wolves. The armed guards watched her every move, their eyes hard and suspicious. They were calculating threat levels, analyzing her slow, deliberate pace. Tessa ignored them entirely. She looked only at Dante Vella. Up close, the danger radiating from him was palpable. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that would have crushed Bianca into dust. But Tessa had been raised by Rosa. She had spent her childhood watching her grandmother chase loud, dangerous men out of their tiny kitchen with a wooden spoon and a string of vicious Sicilian curses. These men were just wearing more expensive suits. They bled the same way. Tessa stepped up to the table. She did not offer a trembling, apologetic smile. She did not beg for forgiveness for Bianca's mistake. She simply picked up a fresh, spotless crystal glass from the empty setting next to Dante and placed it directly in front of him. She gripped the heavy bottle. Her hands were absolute rock. They were the hands of a woman who had carried the weight of the world for years, hands that had scrubbed floors and counted pennies to keep her grandmother alive. She poured the wine. It was a flawless, surgical pour. The dark liquid flowed smoothly, stopping at the exact perfect millimeter. She twisted her wrist sharply, catching the final drop on the lip of the glass before it could fall. Not a single speck of wine touched the white cloth. She stepped back, her face a mask of absolute calm. She stood tall, letting the silence stretch between them. Dante Vella slowly lifted his eyes from the glass. He looked at her. He did not look at her with the disgust she was so used to receiving from Gideon. He did not look at her with the predatory, hollow lust the Wall Street men directed at the thin waitresses. He looked at her with genuine, piercing curiosity. His dark eyes swept over her face, taking in her steady posture, her quiet defiance, the absolute iron in her spine. He noticed the way she breathed, shallow and controlled, fighting the restriction of her uniform. He noticed that she was the only person in the entire building who was not afraid of him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pulling the tension in the room tight enough to snap. Then, Dante spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated deep in Tessa's chest. He declared that from this moment on, only she would serve him. He did not ask Gideon for permission. He did not ask Tessa if she agreed. It was an absolute, unbreakable law, spoken into existence by a man who owned the shadows of the city. Tessa gave a single, brief nod. She turned and walked back to the kitchen, her back straight, leaving the wolves in silence. That night was the beginning of a strange, unspoken era at Aura. Over the next 3 months, the dynamic of the restaurant shifted entirely. Dante Vella became a ghost that haunted the velvet booths. He came in twice a week, always surrounded by his silent guards, always demanding the exact same corner table. And he only ever allowed Tessa to approach. A silent, intense bond began to form between them. It was built on the quiet clinking of crystal glasses, the briefest exchanges of eye contact, and the heavy, unspoken understanding that they were both outsiders in this temple of vanity. Dante watched her constantly. He watched the way she moved with quiet grace despite her size. He watched the way she absorbed the chaotic, nervous energy of the dining room and grounded it into nothing. He was mesmerized by her gravity. He treated her with a quiet, terrifying respect that confused the rest of the staff. Gideon, meanwhile, was slowly losing his mind. He hated Tessa more than ever, but he was utterly powerless. He could not fire the only waitress the head of the Vela Syndicate tolerated. He was forced to watch his most despised employee become the most untouchable person in his restaurant. His suppressed rage festered like an open wound. He looked for any excuse to punish her, any minor infraction to regain his lost control. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. Tessa was standing near the polished wood service station, waiting for Dante's steak to rest. Gideon walked by, his face flushed with anger over a delayed shipment of white truffles. He intentionally veered off his path. He bumped his shoulder hard into Tessa's, nearly knocking her off balance. He hissed a cruel, fatphobic insult under his breath, calling her a clumsy, bloated cow who was ruining his dining room. Tessa caught her balance against the counter. She did not react. She did not let the hurt show on her face. She simply picked up the heavy silver tray and prepared to walk away, but Dante had seen it. From across the dining room, his dark eyes locked onto Gideon. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Dante stood up. He did not rush. He walked across the dining floor with the slow, deliberate pacing of an apex predator tracking wounded prey. The entire restaurant fell dead silent. The clinking of forks stopped. The soft jazz music playing over the speakers suddenly sounded loud and intrusive. He stopped right in front of Gideon. Gideon froze, the artificial tan draining from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale yellow. He looked up at Dante, his mouth opening and closing silently like a dying fish on a dock. Dante did not yell. He leaned in close, invading Gideon's personal space, his voice a terrifyingly smooth whisper. He told Gideon that if he ever spoke to Tessa like that again, if he ever even looked at her with disrespect, they would find Gideon's body in pieces at the bottom of the East River. He reached out and slowly adjusted Gideon's expensive silk tie. He patted Gideon's cheek with a cold, heavy hand, letting the physical contact linger just long enough to instill absolute dread. Gideon nodded frantically, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes and spilling over his cheeks. He backed away, practically tripping over his own polished shoes, and fled to the safety of his locked office. Dante turned to Tessa. For a fraction of a second, the cold, lethal emptiness in his eyes melted away. He gave her a slow, deeply respectful nod. Then he turned and walked back to his table, leaving the dining room in stunned silence. From that night on, Gideon never looked at Tessa again. He spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, his voice trembling, his eyes glued firmly to the floor. Tessa was no longer invisible. She was protected. The 3 months passed in a strange, suspended reality. Tessa's bank account grew rapidly from the massive, silent tips Dante left on the table. She paid off Rosa's mounting medical debts. She bought her grandmother better blankets, better food, and moved her to a room with a window that actually caught the morning sun. And every time she poured Dante's wine, every time she leaned over his table to clear a plate, the air between them crackled with an intense, sensual tension. It was a heavy, magnetic pull that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both of them felt deep in their bones. It was a fragile, beautiful peace, but in the dark, violent world of the Vela Syndicate, peace was always an illusion. It was just the quiet breath before the knife dropped. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky over Manhattan was a bruised, stormy gray. threatening a massive downpour. Tessa arrived at Aura for her afternoon shift, but the heavy glass front doors were locked. The velvet ropes were pulled tight across the entrance. She frowned, pulling her coat tighter against the wind, and went around to the alley entrance. She stepped into the kitchen. It was absolute chaos. Gideon was screaming at the staff, his face a blotchy, panicked purple. The chefs were throwing out entire prep stations of food and starting over from scratch. The waitstaff were on their hands and knees, scrubbing the baseboards with toothbrushes. Tessa grabbed the arm of a passing busboy, demanding to know what was happening. The boy looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. He whispered that the restaurant was closed to the public for the entire night. A private dinner had been booked by the syndicate. Don Vincenzo was flying in from Sicily. The name sent a cold, paralyzing shockwave down Tessa's spine. Vincenzo Vella, Dante's father. He was a 70-something gargoyle of a man who ruled the global empire from a fortified stone estate in the old country. He was ruthless, traditional, and legendary for his uncompromising brutality. He was a man who solved problems with fire and blood. He was the old world coming to inspect the new, and he despised the new. Tessa walked slowly into the dining room. Dante was already there. He was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the rain-slicked streets of New York. He did not look like a dark prince today. He looked like a soldier walking to his own execution. His broad shoulders were tense, pulled tight under his dark suit. His jaw was locked. The smooth, terrifying calm he usually possessed was entirely gone, replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. He heard Tessa approach and turned around sharply. For the first time since she had met him, he looked at her with genuine, unfiltered urgency. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, rapid strides. He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense and pleading. He told her to go home. He told her to hide in the back, to stay completely out of sight, to not let his father see her under any circumstances. He said his father was a monster who destroyed everything good he touched. He said his father would look at her and see only a weakness to be exploited. Tessa looked up at him. She saw the raw fear in his eyes. It was not fear for his own life, or his own empire. It was fear for her. She felt a sudden, fierce urge to stand beside him. She wanted to lend him the iron in her spine. She wanted to tell him that she was not afraid of old men who thought they owned the world. Before she could speak, a deafening crash echoed through the restaurant. The massive oak doors at the front entrance blasted open. The heavy wood slammed against the walls with the force of an explosion. The wind and rain from the street howled into the pristine dining room, blowing out the candles and sending the heavy velvet curtains thrashing violently. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. A dozen men marched in. They were not wearing tailored American suits. They wore heavy wool coats, their faces weathered and hard. They carried themselves with an ancient, brutal violence, and in the center of them walked Don Vincenzo. He was a towering, terrifying figure. His face was carved from stone, his eyes black and lifeless. He radiated an oppressive, suffocating darkness that made the air heavy and hard to breathe. He stopped in the center of the room, his cane striking the marble floor with a sharp, echoing crack. The sound of the cane against the marble seemed to shatter the very air in the room. Vincenzo Vela did not take off his heavy wool coat. He stood like a monolith of the old world, his black eyes slowly sweeping over the velvet booths, the gold leaf chandeliers, and the terrified American staff pressed against the walls. He brought the freezing dampness of the street inside with him. He brought the smell of wet asphalt, cheap tobacco, and ancient, unpunished violence. The dozen men flanking him were not wearing the tailored, silk-lined suits of Dante's modern syndicate. They wore thick, dark fabrics that swallowed the light. They had broken noses, scarred knuckles, and eyes that constantly scanned the room for threats. They carried themselves with a brutal, heavy gravity. They were the old guard. They were the men who solved problems with fire and shallow graves in the Sicilian hills. Dante stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. He did not walk forward to embrace his father. He remained perfectly still, his jaw locked so tightly the muscle ticked beneath his skin. The terrifying, smooth calm he usually commanded was gone. In its place was a rigid, defensive wall of pure tension. Vincenzo began to walk. His cane struck the floor in a slow, rhythmic beat that echoed like a metronome counting down to an execution. He stopped at the edge of the main dining area. He looked at the pristine white tablecloths. He looked at the delicate crystal wine glasses. He looked at the soft, ambient lighting designed to flatter the faces of Manhattan socialites. His upper lip curled in absolute, unfiltered disgust. When he spoke, he did not use English. He did not even use the musical, romantic Italian of the mainland. He spoke in the harsh, guttural mountain dialect of Sicily. It was a language that sounded like a shovel dragging across wet gravel. It was a language of sharp consonants and heavy, grinding stops. He mocked the restaurant. He projected his voice so it carried into every corner of the silent room. He called the establishment a velvet-lined whorehouse for weak men in cheap suits. He mocked the gold on the walls. He mocked the softness of the air. He turned his dead black eyes toward his son. He insulted Dante's tailored clothing. He insulted the way Dante ran the American branch of the empire. He said that Dante had traded the iron of their ancestors for silk and sugar. He said the Vela name was becoming a joke whispered by cowards in glass towers. Dante absorbed the psychological dismantling without blinking. He stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back. He understood every grinding word his father spoke. The staff of Aura did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. It was the tone of an apex predator deciding which throat to rip out first. The waitresses trembled. The busboys stared at their shoes, praying to remain invisible. The private dinner had not even begun, and the dining room had already become a psychological torture chamber. Vincenzo finally took his seat at the head of the massive center table. His men fanned out, taking positions by the doors and the windows. Dante sat to his father's right. Silvio, the ambitious and treacherous underboss, sat to Vincenzo's left. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was a heavy, oppressive blanket that made it difficult to draw a full breath. Back in the kitchen, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a scene of frantic, sweating desperation. Gideon was losing his mind. The general manager was pacing back and forth, his face a blotchy, panicked red. His expensive silk shirt was stained with sweat beneath the arms. His perfect, arrogant facade had completely shattered. He was holding a wooden box. Inside the box rested a 100-year-old bottle of Bordeaux. It was the crown jewel of the restaurant's reserve cellar. It was a bottle that cost more than most of the kitchen staff made in a year. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of the dinner, the ultimate offering of respect to the Don. Gideon shoved the wooden box into Bianca's chest. Bianca stumbled backward, barely catching the heavy wood. She was Gideon's favorite waitress. She was tall, impossibly thin, and usually moved with the arrogant grace of a runway model. But right now, Bianca was a broken shell. She was weeping silently. Her mascara was running down her pale cheeks in dark, jagged lines. Her hands were shaking so violently the wooden box rattled against her collarbone. She shook her head. She whispered that she could not do it. She said she could not go out there. She knew she would drop the bottle. She knew those men would kill her if she made a mistake. Gideon's fear instantly mutated into vicious, ugly rage. He grabbed Bianca by the arm, his manicured fingers digging brutally into her thin flesh. He raised his other hand, his palm open, fully intending to strike her across the face to force her into submission. He hissed that she was a useless, pathetic child. He told her she would serve the wine or he would destroy her life. Before Gideon's hand could fall, another hand caught his wrist in midair. It was Tessa. She did not squeeze his wrist. She simply held it in place with the immovable, steady strength of a woman who had spent her life carrying heavy burdens. Gideon froze. He looked at Tessa, his eyes wide with shock and fury. Tessa did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, unassuming steel. She told Gideon to let the girl go. She reached out and took the heavy wooden box from Bianca's trembling hands. She pulled the ancient, dust-covered bottle from the velvet lining. She held it firmly, feeling the cool, solid weight of the glass against her palm. Gideon snatched his wrist away. He took a step back, his chest heaving. He looked at Tessa's size 20 frame, at the corset digging into her ribs, at the calm, unbothered expression on her face. His lip curled into a venomous sneer. He whispered that she was going to embarrass them all. He predicted that the Don would take one look at her fat, clumsy body and burn the restaurant to the ground. He swore that when she failed, he would personally throw her into the street. Tessa did not blink. She did not let his cruel words penetrate her armor. She thought of Rosa. She thought of the sterile nursing home room and the medical bills that this night would pay for. She thought of the ancient, grinding language of the mountains that lived inside her head. She turned her back on Gideon. She pushed through the heavy double doors and walked into the dining room. The air in the main room was thick with the smell of expensive cigar smoke and wet wool. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Tessa walked across the thick velvet carpet. She did not rush. She did not try to make herself small. She felt the eyes of a dozen armed men lock onto her. She felt the cold, calculating stares of the old guard analyzing her every step. She felt the heavy, dangerous weight of their suspicion. She looked toward the table. Dante was watching her. His dark eyes were wide with sudden, sharp alarm. He had told her to hide. He had told her to stay in the back. Seeing her walk into the center of his father's firing line sent a visible jolt of panic through his rigid posture. His jaw clenched. He shifted his weight, his hand moving subtly toward the inside of his tailored jacket. He was preparing for violence. Tessa gave him a fraction of a nod. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement to tell him to stay still. She approached the head of the table. She stopped directly to the right of Don Vincenzo. The old wolf stopped talking to Silvio. He slowly turned his massive, stone-carved head. He looked up at Tessa. His black, lifeless eyes traveled up and down her body. He took in her broad shoulders, her thick waist, the heavy, solid presence of her frame. He looked at her as if she were a piece of rotting meat placed on his pristine table. His expression hardened into absolute, unfiltered contempt. He leaned back in his heavy wooden chair. He did not speak to Tessa. He assumed this large, silent American girl was completely deaf to the world he came from. He looked across the table at Silvio and his guards. He opened his mouth and spoke in the archaic Madoni mountain dialect. He delivered a brutal, merciless insult. He used the grinding, harsh words of the old country to call her a bloated, pathetic creature. He said it was a disgrace to be served by a woman who looked like a fat sow waddling through mud. He asked his men if this was what the great Vela Empire had been reduced to. He asked if his son was now surrounding himself with pigs because he was too weak to hunt with wolves. The guards chuckled. It was a dark, cruel sound that rumbled in their chests. Silvio smiled a thin, treacherous smile. Dante understood every single word. The heavy oak table groaned in protest as Dante gripped the edge. His knuckles turned stark white. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. His eyes went completely, terrifyingly black. The lethal possessiveness he harbored for Tessa erupted inside him like a dormant volcano. He did not care that this was his father. He did not care that there were a dozen armed men in the room. He was about to stand up. He was about to draw his weapon. He was ready to burn his own empire to the ground to defend her honor. But Tessa beat him to it. She did not flinch at the insult. She did not drop her gaze. She simply stepped forward, invading Vincenzo's personal space with absolute, unshakable calm. She produced the silver wine key. She cut the foil of the 100-year-old bottle with surgical precision. She drove the corkscrew into the ancient cork and pulled it free with a soft, satisfying pop. She gripped the heavy bottle. Her hands were absolute rock. She poured the dark, blood-red vintage into Vincenzo's crystal glass. The liquid flowed smoothly, catching the dim light of the chandeliers. She stopped at the exact perfect millimeter. She twisted her wrist sharply, catching the final drop on the lip of the glass. Not a single speck of wine touched the white tablecloth. She placed the bottle down on the table. She took a half step back. She stood up to her full height, squaring her broad shoulders. She looked the deadliest man in the world, dead in the eye. And then Tessa opened her mouth. She did not speak in English. She did not speak in modern Italian. She fired back in the exact same dead dialect. Her pronunciation was flawless. Her tone was not soft or apologetic. It was harsh, ancient, and rhythmic. Her voice sounded like grinding stones, echoing the brutal cadence of the Sicilian mountains perfectly. She spoke the words clearly, letting them ring through the silent dining room. She told him that it was indeed a terrible tragedy. She said it was a tragedy for a fat sow to be forced to serve such fine, rare vinegar to an old, blind wolf who had lost his teeth. The room stopped existing. The air froze in the lungs of every man present. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to deafen. The reaction of the old guard was instantaneous and violent. The sound of heavy leather creaking and metal clicking echoed through the room. A dozen hands reached inside heavy wool coats, gripping the cold steel of their firearms. They were ready to gun her down where she stood for insulting the Don. Dante was frozen in absolute, paralyzed shock. His hands were still gripping the edge of the table, but all the anger had drained from his face, replaced by pure, unadulterated awe. He stared at Tessa as if she had just descended from the sky wielding a flaming sword. He could not comprehend what he had just heard. Silvio's treacherous smile vanished instantly. His face went pale. Vincenzo sat perfectly still. His hand was resting on the silver handle of his cane. His black eyes bored into Tessa's face. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not order his men to fire. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. It was a silence so heavy it threatened to crack the marble floor. Tessa did not look away. She held the old wolf's gaze, her spine made of solid iron. And then, the The gargoyle's face cracked. The deep lines around Vincenzo's mouth twitched. His chest began to heave. A low, rumbling sound started deep in his throat. Vincenzo threw his massive head back and erupted into a roaring, joyous laugh. It was a massive, booming sound that shook the crystal glasses on the table. It was the laugh of a man who had not been surprised in 40 years. It was a laugh of pure, unfiltered delight. He slammed his heavy, scarred hand down on the oak table. The loud smack made his guards jump. He waved his hand in the air, signaling his men to stand down. The guards slowly, reluctantly, pulled their hands away from their weapons. Vincenzo leaned forward. The contempt was entirely gone from his eyes. In its place was a burning, intense curiosity. He spoke again, still using the grinding dialect of the mountains. He demanded to know who she was. He demanded to know who had taught an American girl to speak the tongue of the stones with such perfect, brutal disrespect. Tessa did not break eye contact. She answered him in the same ancient tongue. She told him that her grandmother had taught her. She said her grandmother was a baker's daughter. She spoke the name clearly into the quiet room. She said her name was Rosa, from the village of Petralia Soprana. Vincenzo turned completely white. The booming laughter died instantly in his throat. The color drained from his weathered face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His hand trembled slightly as it gripped the handle of his cane. He stared at Tessa, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He whispered the name Rosa. He said it like a prayer. He looked around the table, his eyes wide and distant, lost in a memory that was over half a century old. He switched to heavily accented English, wanting everyone in the room to understand the weight of what he was about to say. He told the room that in the bitter winter of 1958, he was a young man bleeding to death in a cobblestone alley in Petralia Soprana. He had taken a rival family's bullet to the shoulder. He was freezing, terrified, and waiting for the police to find his body. He said a young baker's daughter named Rosa had found him in the snow. He told them how this fierce, fearless woman had dragged his heavy, bleeding body down a flight of stone stairs into a dark cellar. He described how she had dug the lead bullet out of his torn flesh with a simple paring knife, while he bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming. He said she had hidden him in the dark for 3 days. She had smuggled him bread and water while the police tore the village apart looking for him. Vincenzo looked back up at Tessa. His black eyes were shining with an emotion that looked dangerously close to reverence. He said that he owed his life to that woman. He said that without Rosa, there would be no Dante, there would be no syndicate, there would be no empire. He said he owed his entire existence to the bloodline standing right in front of him. Suddenly, the heavy double doors leading to the kitchen swung open violently. Gideon rushed into the dining room. He had been watching the interaction through the small circular window in the door. He had seen the guards reach for their guns. He had seen the shocking, tense silence. He had seen the dawn turn completely white. Because he could not hear the words, and because he was blinded by his own arrogance and fear, Gideon assumed the absolute worst. He assumed Tessa had spilled the wine. He assumed she had insulted the Don in English. He assumed she had just signed his death warrant. Gideon lunged forward, his face red with panic and fury. He crossed the dining room floor in a frantic sprint. He reached Tessa and grabbed her roughly by the shoulder. He dug his manicured nails into her arm, trying to physically drag her away from the table. He screamed at her. His voice was shrill and hysterical. He called her a stupid, useless cow. He told her she was fired. He turned to Vincenzo, babbling frantic, pathetic apologies, promising that this fat embarrassment would never set foot in his restaurant again. Gideon did not get to finish his apology. Dante moved faster than the human eye could track. The lethal, coiled tension that had been building inside the young boss finally snapped. He was out of his heavy wooden chair and across the floor in a fraction of a second. He did not punch Gideon. He did not draw a weapon. He simply reached out with one massive, powerful hand and grabbed the general manager by the throat. Dante lifted Gideon completely off the marble floor. Gideon's frantic screaming was cut off instantly, replaced by a wet, choking gasp. His eyes bulged from his skull. His expensive leather shoes kicked wildly in the empty air, desperately searching for the ground. Dante held him there effortlessly. His dark eyes were empty voids of pure, murderous intent. The smooth, handsome face of the modern corporate boss was gone. This was the face of a Sicilian warlord. Dante leaned in close to Gideon's turning purple face. His voice was a terrifying, demonic whisper that carried clearly through the silent room. He told Gideon that if he ever touched his queen again, if he ever even breathed in her direction, he would personally peel the skin from his bones while he was still alive. With a violent, dismissive flick of his wrist, Dante threw the general manager across the room. Gideon flew through the air and crashed hard into a heavy wooden serving cart. The impact shattered dozens of expensive porcelain plates and sent silver cutlery clattering across the floor. Gideon collapsed into the wreckage, clutching his bruised throat, gasping for air, and weeping in absolute terror. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, trying to press himself into the wall to escape Dante's wrath. Dante did not look at him again. He turned his attention back to Tessa. His chest was heaving. His hands were curled into tight fists at his sides. He looked at her, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire. He was breathing hard, the adrenaline of the violence still coursing through his veins. Vincenzo watched this entire display of lethal possessiveness, with a slow, approving nod. The old wolf looked at his son. He saw the fire. He saw the iron. He saw that Dante was not as soft as he had feared. Vincenzo turned his gaze back to Tessa. He reached out with his heavy, scarred hand and gestured to the empty chair directly to his left. He spoke in English, his voice a deep, respectful rumble. He told Tessa to sit down. He told her that the granddaughter of Rosa from Petralia Soprana did not serve wine to anyone in this world. He said she drank it with kings. Tessa looked at the empty chair. She looked at Dante, who gave her a slow, deeply emotional nod. She untied the black apron from her waist. She let it fall to the marble floor. She stepped forward and took her seat at the right hand of the Mafia royalty. The corset of her uniform suddenly felt like a discarded shell. The invisible armor she had worn for years was no longer necessary. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the fire. The rest of the private dinner was a surreal blur. Gideon remained cowering in the corner, too terrified to move. The waitstaff served the food with trembling hands, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. But at the center table, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Vincenzo spoke to Tessa for hours. They spoke in the grinding dialect of the mountains, sharing stories of the old country, of survival, of the harsh realities of their bloodlines. Dante sat beside her, his hand resting possessively on the back of her chair, his eyes never leaving her face. The next day, the reality of Tessa's world changed forever. Dante walked into Aura at noon. He did not wear a suit. He wore a dark cashmere sweater and an expression of absolute authority. He walked directly into Gideon's office. He threw a thick stack of $100 bills onto the desk. He told the trembling, bruised manager that he was buying out Tessa's employment contract permanently. He told Gideon that if he ever spoke her name again, the money would be replaced by a bullet. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dante's men had arrived at the underfunded nursing home in Queens. They did not ask for permission. They packed Rosa's meager belongings into expensive leather bags. They escorted the fierce old woman into the back of a bulletproof luxury SUV. Dante moved Rosa to an elite, private penthouse care center overlooking Central Park. It was a facility with round-the-clock private doctors, silk sheets, and a garden terrace. When Rosa saw Dante, she recognized the dark, dangerous look in his eyes. She gripped his face with her frail hands and told him in rapid Sicilian to protect her granddaughter, or she would dig the bullet out of his shoulder too. Dante had smiled and sworn his life on it. By 6 o'clock in the evening, Dante brought Tessa into his fortified, opulent world. He took her to his massive penthouse in the sky. He showed her rooms filled with rich, flowing silks and velvet furniture. He told her she would never wear a corset again. He told her she would never be invisible again. But the transition of power in the underworld is never peaceful. It is always accompanied by the silent sharpening of knives. In the dark, velvet-lined corners of Dante's estate, Silvio watched. The ambitious underboss stood in the shadows of the grand hallway. He watched Dante look at Tessa with absolute reverence. He saw the way the young boss's guard dropped when she was in the room. He saw what he believed was a fatal weakness. Silvio stared at Tessa with greedy, treacherous eyes. He hated the American boss. He hated the sudden influence of this heavy, quiet waitress. He believed the empire belonged to him. He stepped deeper into the shadows. He pulled a secure, encrypted burner phone from the inside pocket of his jacket. He dialed a number with a Chicago area code. He waited for the click of the connection. And in the darkness, Silvio began muttering into the receiver. He did not speak in English. He did not speak in modern Italian. The harsh, grinding syllables of Petralia Soprana slipped from his tongue like venom, outlining a time, a place, and a price for the head of Dante Vela. Silvio stood in the shadows of the grand hallway, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors of the master suite. He believed he was a genius. He believed he was the only man in the syndicate with the vision to see the truth. To Silvio, Dante was a weak, distracted boy playing dress-up in a king's chair. He despised the way Dante had brought a common waitress into their fortified world. He saw Tessa's heavy frame and quiet demeanor as proof of Dante's declining standards. In the brutal mathematics of the underworld, Silvio calculated that a boss who prioritized a fat American girl over syndicate business was a boss waiting to be slaughtered. He finished the call. He pressed the red button on the burner phone, snapped the plastic device in half, and dropped the pieces into a decorative bronze vase. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, a treacherous smile playing on his lips. The Chicago cartel had accepted the terms. The hit was scheduled. The Vela Empire was about to change hands, but Silvio's fatal flaw was his arrogance. He believed that because he could not see the intelligence in Tessa's eyes, it did not exist. He did not understand that invisibility was a weapon she had spent her entire life mastering. Miles above the chaotic, rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, Tessa was discovering a world she had never dared to dream of. The penthouse was a fortress in the sky. It was a sprawling masterpiece of floor-to-ceiling glass, dark mahogany wood, and imported Italian marble. It was completely silent, insulated from the screaming sirens and the grinding gears of the city below. For the first time in her life, Tessa did not have to listen to the frantic yelling of a kitchen line or the cruel, mocking whispers of a general manager. She stood in the center of the massive master bedroom. At her feet lay a pile of stiff, black fabric. It was the size 14 uniform, the corset that had bruised her ribs, the cheap polyester that had suffocated her skin. Dante had ordered his men to retrieve it from her small apartment, not to keep it, but to let her destroy it. Tessa looked at the uniform. She remembered the feeling of Gideon's manicured fingers digging into her arm. She remembered the sheer, exhausting terror of trying to make herself small in a world that demanded she disappear. She stepped over the black fabric and walked toward the massive walk-in closet. Dante had not just bought her clothes. He had commissioned a wardrobe fit for a queen. There were no restrictive zippers. There were no garments designed to compress, hide, or shame her body. There were only rich, flowing silks, soft cashmeres, and heavy velvets. She reached out and touched a robe made of deep emerald silk. It slipped through her fingers like water. She wrapped it around her shoulders, feeling the cool, luxurious fabric drape perfectly over her broad hips and thick thighs. The bedroom door opened with a soft click. Dante stepped into the room. He had just returned from a sit-down with the Brooklyn Capos. He looked exhausted. The lethal, terrifying mask he wore for the underworld was still firmly in place, his jaw locked, his dark eyes cold and calculating. But the moment he saw Tessa standing by the window, wrapped in the emerald silk, the mask shattered. The tension drained from his broad shoulders. He let out a long, heavy breath, as if he had been holding it since he left the apartment that morning. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, tossed it onto a leather chair, and walked slowly toward her. He did not look at her with the hollow, predatory lust of the Wall Street men. He did not look at her with the disgusted, calculating eyes of Gideon. He looked at her with absolute, unfiltered worship. Dante stopped inches away from her. He reached out with a large, heavy hand. His knuckles were scarred from years of violence, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing softly against her cheekbone. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her solid, heavy frame flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin. He whispered that she was the only real thing in this entire city. For weeks, Dante systematically dismantled the years of psychological abuse Gideon had inflicted upon her. He treated her body as a sacred temple. When she hesitated, when the old ghosts of shame whispered in her ear, Dante silenced them with slow, deliberate reverence. He kissed the curves that Gideon had mocked. He ran his hands over the thick flesh of her thighs, telling her in a low, gravelly voice that she was built like the ancient goddesses of their homeland. He told her that the starving, fragile women of Manhattan were ghosts, but she was the earth itself. Their romance was not a frantic, desperate collision. It was a deep, slow-burning fire. It was built on immense mutual respect, silent understandings, and the heavy, sensual tension that had sparked the very first night she poured his wine. And while Tessa healed, Rosa thrived. Tessa visited her grandmother twice a week at the elite penthouse care facility. The sterile, depressing walls of the Queen's nursing home were a distant memory. Rosa now had a corner suite with a panoramic view of Central Park. She had private doctors who spoke to her with absolute deference. More importantly, she had the respect of the Vela Syndicate. Dante had assigned 2 of his most loyal, old-world guards to stand outside Rosa's door 24 hours a day. When Tessa arrived, the heavily armed men would bow their heads respectfully, greeting her in the ancient dialect. Rosa sat in a plush armchair by the window, A thick wool blanket draped over her lap. Her sharp, intelligent eyes missed nothing. She took Tessa's hands, feeling the soft skin that was no longer calloused from scrubbing industrial kitchen floors. Rosa smiled, a fierce, proud expression. She told Tessa that the blood of the mountains always rises to the top. She warned her granddaughter that the air at the top of the mountain was thin, and the winds were treacherous. She told her to keep her eyes open, and her mouth shut, until the time was right to strike. Tessa took those words to heart. She knew that Dante's world was a fortress, but every fortress had rats in the walls. The treacherous underbelly of the syndicate was beginning to rot, and the stench was growing stronger by the day. It culminated on a humid Friday evening in late August. Dante was hosting a lavish syndicate gathering at his sprawling, fortified estate on the cliffs of Long Island. It was a mandatory show of strength and unity. The massive stone mansion was filled with the most dangerous men on the East Coast. The driveway was lined with black, armored luxury vehicles. The grand ballroom echoed with the clinking of crystal whiskey glasses, the low murmur of negotiations, and the thick, suffocating smell of expensive Cuban cigars. It was a room filled with predators pretending to be civilized businessmen. Tessa was present, but she deliberately faded into the background. She wore a simple, elegant black dress that did not draw attention. She used her old armor of invisibility, slipping into the shadows of the grand estate. She understood that these men, the capos and the underbosses, viewed her as a temporary distraction. They saw a quiet, heavy-set American girl who did not speak their language and did not understand their business. They ignored her completely, and that was exactly what she wanted. As the evening wore on, the air in the ballroom grew stifling. Tessa slipped out through the heavy glass doors onto the expansive stone terrace. The terrace overlooked the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The sea breeze was cool and sharp. She walked to the far corner of the terrace, settling into a deep, high-backed wicker chair hidden by a massive potted fern. She pulled a pair of wooden knitting needles and a ball of thick, charcoal-gray yarn from her woven bag. She began to knit. The rhythmic, repetitive motion was a grounding technique Rosa had taught her years ago. It made her look soft. It made her look harmless. It made her look like a woman who had no thoughts beyond the next stitch. 10 minutes later, the glass doors slid open. Silvio stepped out onto the terrace. He was sweating slightly, his eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit stone patio. He needed to make the final confirmation call to the Chicago cartel. He needed absolute privacy. He scanned the terrace. His eyes landed on the far corner. He saw Tessa sitting in the shadows, her head bowed, the wooden needles clicking softly in her hands. Silvio let out a quiet, dismissive scoff. He relaxed his shoulders. To him, Tessa was less than human. She was a piece of furniture. She was a fat, ignorant cow knitting a sweater while the men decided the fate of the world. He was absolutely certain she could not understand a single word of the complex, archaic language he was about to use. He walked to the edge of the stone balustrade, turning his back to her. He pulled the encrypted burner phone from his jacket and dialed the Chicago number. Tessa did not look up. She did not stop knitting. Silvio began to speak. He spoke entirely in the coded mountain dialect of Madoni. It was the harsh, grinding language of stones and blood. It was the language Rosa had drilled into Tessa's head since she was a child. Silvio's voice was low, but the sea breeze carried every single syllable directly to Tessa's ears. He confirmed the assassination plot. He told the men in Chicago that Dante was growing weak, blinded by his new obsession. He detailed the exact location of the ambush. It would happen on Tuesday night, at the abandoned shipping yards in Red Hook, Brooklyn. He gave them the exact time, 11:15 in the evening. He told them Dante would be traveling with only 4 guards, expecting a routine inspection of a smuggled weapons shipment. He promised the Chicago shooters that the perimeter would be clear. He promised them that the security cameras would be disabled. He finished the call by stating his own price. He wanted 50% of the East Coast port revenues, and the undisputed title of Don. Tessa remained perfectly still. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face was a mask of absolute, blank serenity. Her hands did not tremble. She did not drop a single stitch. She continued to knit, the charcoal yarn slipping smoothly through her fingers. Silvio ended the call. He turned around, slipping the phone back into his jacket. He glanced one last time at the quiet woman in the corner. He smiled a cruel, victorious smile, and walked back into the ballroom to drink Dante's whiskey. Tessa waited exactly 5 minutes. Then she calmly packed her knitting into her bag, stood up, and walked inside. The party lasted until 2 in the morning. When the final armored vehicle rolled down the long gravel driveway, the massive stone estate fell into a heavy, exhausted silence. Dante retreated to his private study on the second floor. The study was a dark, masculine room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, heavy leather armchairs, and the lingering scent of old paper and bourbon. Dante stood behind his massive oak desk, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He looked drained. The constant vigilance, the endless paranoia of searching for the knife in the dark, was taking its toll. He rubbed his temples, staring blankly at the glowing embers in the stone fireplace. The heavy oak doors of the study opened. Tessa stepped inside. She closed the doors behind her. She reached out and turned the heavy brass lock. A loud, solid click echoed through the quiet room. Dante looked up, the exhaustion in his eyes softening instantly. He offered her a tired, genuine smile. He asked her if the noise of the capos had given her a headache. Tessa did not answer immediately. She walked slowly across the Persian rug. She moved around the massive desk. Dante sat down in his heavy leather chair. Tessa stepped between his knees. She turned and sat down sideways on his lap, resting her weight against his chest. Dante sighed, wrapping his strong arms around her waist. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the soft, sweet scent of her skin. He murmured that she was the only piece he had left in this world. Tessa rested her hand on the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. She held him close for a long moment, letting him feel her steady, unshakable heartbeat. Then she spoke. Her voice was not soft. It was not comforting. It was quiet, steady, and chillingly precise. She told him that Silvio was going to kill him on Tuesday night. Dante went completely, terrifyingly still. The warmth in his body vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, lethal tension of a predator. He did not pull away from her, but his muscles turned to solid rock. Tessa did not hesitate. She did not sugarcoat the betrayal. She translated Silvio's entire assassination plot, word for word, with flawless accuracy. She gave him the location, the abandoned shipping yards in Red Hook. She gave him the time, 11:15 in the evening. She told him about the Chicago cartel shooters. She told him about the disabled security cameras. She told him about the 4 guards Silvio expected him to bring. She detailed the exact price Silvio had demanded for his head. Dante listened in absolute silence. When she finished, the study was so quiet she could hear the ice melting in his bourbon glass. Dante slowly pulled his face away from her neck. He looked up into her eyes. He did not ask her if she was sure. He did not question her understanding of the dialect. He knew the iron in her spine. He knew the blood of Rosa ran in her veins. He knew she would never make a mistake of this magnitude. The realization washed over him in a massive, overwhelming wave. His beautiful, quiet lover was not just a sanctuary from the violence. She was his greatest intelligence asset. She was the ultimate weapon, hidden in plain sight, cloaked in the arrogance of his enemies. A slow, dark, terrifying smile spread across Dante's face. It was the smile of a king who had just been handed the winning piece on a bloody chessboard. He reached up and cupped her face in his large hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones with deep, profound reverence. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. His voice was a rough, gravelly whisper filled with absolute awe. He called her his brilliant queen. Tuesday night arrived with a torrential downpour. The abandoned shipping yards in Red Hook were a desolate wasteland of rusted metal containers, broken asphalt, and deep, oily puddles. The freezing rain lashed against the corrugated steel roofs, drowning out all other sounds. Silvio sat in the passenger seat of a black sport utility vehicle parked in the shadows of a massive crane. He checked his gold watch. It was 11:10. He looked out through the rain-streaked window. The Chicago cartel shooters were in position. 6 heavily armed men were hidden among the shipping containers, their silenced automatic weapons trained on the designated kill zone. Silvio's heart pounded with greedy anticipation. In 5 minutes, Dante Vela would drive into the trap. In 10 minutes, Silvio would be the undisputed dawn of the East Coast. At exactly 11:15, a single pair of headlights pierced the darkness. A black luxury sedan rolled slowly into the shipping yard. It splashed through the deep puddles, coming to a halt exactly where Silvio had instructed. Silvio gripped the door handle, a vicious grin spreading across his face. He waited for Dante to step out of the vehicle. He waited for the Chicago shooters to open fire and tear the young boss to pieces. But the doors of the sedan did not open. Instead, the headlights suddenly clicked off, plunging the yard back into absolute darkness. Silvio frowned. A cold prickle of unease crawled up his spine. He leaned forward, squinting through the rain. Suddenly, the night erupted in blinding, terrifying light. Dozens of high-powered floodlights snapped on simultaneously from the roofs of the surrounding warehouses. The entire shipping yard was illuminated with the harsh, unforgiving glare of a stadium. Silvio gasped, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes. When his vision adjusted, the blood froze in his veins. The Chicago shooters were not hidden. They were surrounded. Over 40 men from the Vela Syndicate had silently infiltrated the yard hours ago. They were a terrifying mix of Dante's modern tactical enforcers and Vincenzo's brutal old-world guards. They stood on top of the shipping containers, behind the rusted cranes, and blocking every single exit. Every single weapon was aimed directly at the cartel men. It was not an ambush. It was an execution. Dante Vela stepped out from the shadows of a nearby warehouse. He was not wearing a suit. He wore a heavy black tactical coat, the rain slicking his dark hair to his forehead. He walked with the slow, terrifying calm of the Grim Reaper. He did not shout orders. He did not offer a theatrical villain speech. He simply raised his right hand and then dropped it sharply to his side. The slaughter was instantaneous and deafening. The synchronized gunfire echoed through the Brooklyn night like rolling thunder. The Chicago shooters were cut down before they could even raise their weapons. The violent, calculated bloodbath lasted less than 10 seconds. When the echoing cracks of gunfire faded, the only sound left was the heavy rain hitting the asphalt. Silvio was paralyzed with terror. He sat in the vehicle, his mouth open in a silent scream, his bladder releasing into his expensive trousers. The driver's side window shattered inward. Two massive, scarred hands reached in, grabbed Silvio by the collar of his jacket, and dragged him violently through the broken glass. He was thrown onto the wet, oily asphalt at Dante's feet. Silvio scrambled onto his hands and knees, coughing up rainwater and blood from the glass cuts. He looked up at Dante, his eyes wide with absolute, pathetic panic. He begged. He babbled frantically, swearing his loyalty, claiming it was a misunderstanding, claiming the Chicago men had forced him into it. He cried, the tears mixing with the rain on his face. He stared at Dante, his voice cracking as he asked the one question that was tearing his mind apart. He begged to know how Dante had found out. He swore the phone line was secure. He swore he had only spoken in the old tongue. Dante looked down at the treacherous underboss with eyes as cold and empty as a grave. He crouched down, his black boots splashing in the puddle of rainwater. He leaned in close to Silvio's ear. Dante did not speak in English. He whispered a single, terrifying phrase in the harsh, grinding dialect of the Madoni Mountains. He told Silvio that the Queen hears everything, and the Queen forgets nothing. Silvio's eyes widened in horrifying realization. The image of the heavy, quiet waitress knitting in the shadows of the terrace flashed through his mind. The absolute, crushing weight of his own arrogance crashed down upon him. The ignorant cow had been the executioner all along. Dante stood up. He turned his back on the traitor and walked away into the rain. A single gunshot rang out behind him, silencing Silvio forever. The rot was cut out. The Chicago threat was eliminated. Dante's absolute control over the East Coast was cemented in blood and iron. 1 month later, the velvet ropes were pulled tight across the entrance of Aura. The Michelin-starred restaurant was closed to the public, but the dining room was packed. It was not a tense, terrifying private dinner with the old guard. It was a victory gala. The room was filled with the most powerful figures in New York: Wall Street billionaires, corrupt politicians, and the newly unified capos of the Vela Syndicate mingled under the gold-leaf chandeliers. The atmosphere was electric, buzzing with the intoxicating energy of absolute power. Standing near the kitchen doors, Gideon was a nervous, sweating wreck. The general manager had lost 20 pounds in the last month. His expensive suits hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His artificial tan could not hide the sickly, pale terror that permanently stained his face. He knew what had happened in Brooklyn. The whispers of the bloodbath had reached even the polished floors of Manhattan. He knew that Dante Vela now owned the city, the shadows, and everything in between. And he knew how he had treated the woman who slept in the king's bed. Gideon wrung his hands together, his eyes darting frantically toward the massive oak doors at the front entrance. He was waiting for the axe to fall. He was waiting for Dante to walk in and finally make good on his promise to peel the skin from his bones. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy doors swung open. The low murmur of conversation in the dining room died instantly. The string quartet playing in the corner abruptly stopped. Every eye in the room turned toward the entrance. Dante Vela walked in. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight black tuxedo. He radiated a dark, magnetic authority that commanded absolute silence. But no one was looking at Dante. They were looking at the woman on his arm. Tessa stepped into the light of the chandeliers. She was no longer the invisible waitress in a suffocating, undersized corset. She was a vision of lethal, untouchable majesty. She wore a custom-made midnight blue silk gown, the fabric draped flawlessly over her broad shoulders, cinched perfectly at her waist, and flowed over her thick hips like liquid night. The dress did not hide her size, it celebrated it. It demanded that the world look at her and acknowledge her power. Around her neck rested a heavy necklace of flawless Antwerp diamonds, a gift from Vincenzo himself, sent directly from the fortress in Sicily. The jewels caught the light, throwing fractured rainbows across the velvet walls. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant twist, exposing the long, proud line of her neck. Her face was a mask of serene, unshakable confidence. She possessed the gravity of a planet. The Wall Street men who had once ignored her now stared in open-mouthed awe. The syndicate capos bowed their heads in deep, genuine respect as she passed. Tessa walked slowly through the dining room, her hand resting lightly on Dante's arm. She guided him toward the back of the room, directly toward the kitchen doors, directly toward Gideon. Gideon saw her coming and his knees practically gave out. He grabbed the edge of a serving station to keep from collapsing. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He looked at the diamonds, at the silk, at the absolute iron in her eyes, and he knew his life was over. Tessa stopped 2 feet away from him. Dante stood silently beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark eyes fixed on the trembling manager with cold amusement. He was letting his queen handle her own business. Gideon opened his mouth to beg. He wanted to apologize for the corset. He wanted to apologize for the fatphobic insults. He wanted to offer her the restaurant, his money, his life. But his throat was completely dry. No sound came out. Tessa did not yell. She did not raise her hand. She did not need to use the brutal violence of the men who surrounded her. She simply leaned in close to Gideon. The scent of her expensive custom perfume completely overwhelmed the smell of his nervous sweat. She looked down at the serving station. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a crystal water glass sitting on a silver tray. She spoke in perfect, polished, East Coast English. Her voice was a soft, terrifying whisper that cut through Gideon's soul like a razor blade. She told him there was a water spot on the rim of the glass. She smiled, a cold, devastating expression. She whispered that he should probably clean it. Before her husband decided to fire him, Gideon let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. He practically collapsed over the serving station, his shaking hands desperately grabbing a white linen napkin to scrub the spotless glass. He was broken. He was completely, utterly destroyed by a single sentence. Tessa stood up straight. She did not look at him again. She had reclaimed her dignity, and she had left his in ashes. Dante stepped forward. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. Right there, in the center of the opulent dining room, in front of the trembling New York elite and the deadliest killers in the country, Dante Vella turned his queen to face him. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. He looked into her eyes with a fierce, burning devotion that made the rest of the world cease to exist. He kissed her. It was not a polite, socially acceptable kiss. It was deep, possessive, and absolute. It was a physical declaration of war against anyone who dared to question her place at his side. He claimed her as his equal, his partner, and the undisputed co-ruler of his dark empire. When he finally pulled away, the room erupted into applause. Led by the heavy, scarred hands of the Sicilian old guard, Tessa looked out over the sea of faces. She felt the heavy weight of the diamonds against her collarbone. She felt the solid, unshakable presence of the most dangerous man in the world standing at her back, ready to burn cities to the ground in her name. She had spent years making herself small. She had endured the cruelty of a shallow world that worshipped fragile, starving aesthetics. She had used invisibility as a shield to survive the crushing weight of poverty and abuse. But she had learned the ultimate truth of the shadows. True power does not need to scream to be heard. True beauty cannot be starved into a size 0, and it cannot be contained in a corset. True strength is forged in the quiet, grinding endurance of the invisible. The mocked, heavy-set waitress of Aura was dead. The untouchable queen of the syndicate had finally taken her throne.